जय हिंद, जय भारत, नमस्कार. मैं कमांडर चक्रपाणी and I am now on Decoding 24/7 and Chax Simplifies, a dual channel on which we discuss what is happening in the world and how does it impact India especially. And today we have with us Pendy. Pendy, why don't you introduce yourself rather than my introducing and setting out what is it that you bring to the table?
Thanks, Chax. First of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's great to meet you yesterday, and today we are online. I worked in India after my undergrad in IIT Madras and my business school at IIM Calcutta for about 6 years at a British multinational called Metalbox. At that time, I considered myself a packaging expert, and then moved on to the US to do a second MBA. You'd wonder, why would anybody do a second MBA? First of all, I got a free ride and everything was paid for. But more importantly, it was a fantastic program. 2 years of MBA compressed into 1 year, meant for professionals with 10 years of work experience. I had 6. I could learn from my peers. People came from 14 to 15 different countries. And at that time, Japan could do no wrong. China was blossoming. I was the only guy from India. I had a colleague from Pakistan, and then had folks from Latin America. So it was a very good way of learning how the Koreans, the Japanese, etc., think and do business. And subsequently, I had the good fortune to join Seiko, the Japanese multinational known for watches, but got an opportunity to build a new business for them and take it worldwide. So that's where I cut my teeth, gave me a chance to grow the business from scratch, going worldwide. That's been kind of what I've been passionate about. Did a similar thing at Hewlett-Packard, started a business, took it worldwide. And HP also, my last role was to lead as a vice president and general manager, their $8 billion high-volume laserjet printer business. At that time, a decision was made to move the headquarters from US to China, and it gave me a chance to experience China firsthand. And I lived there for almost about a year and a half to 2 years. And subsequently, after my corporate career, I had an academic stint leading the same program, which gave me a chance to come to the US as the dean and executive director. And at that time, we had even more students from China, even more internationalization. And then subsequently, I'm now working for the government of Scotland's Economic Development Agency, which where my team and I help Scottish companies to start or grow their business in the US. And for that, we got to keep a good eye on geopolitics, because that can create opportunities for a country like Scotland in the US, or it could be an impediment. So knowing those dynamics helps us in guiding the companies from there to be successful in a very large market like the US or Canada. So I'll stop there. I think that was more of an introduction, but just wanted to share my background.
Yeah, absolutely, Pendy. It is actually a great pleasure to have you here. And effectively, well, we have a helicopter going past, so we'll just wait for it to fly away from here. Okay, so like I was saying, you have effectively established yourself as an expert in international trade, and therefore, my set of questions with respect to China especially. Pendy, a lot of people say comprehensive national power is a combination of multiple factors. Among them, big ones are very naturally the economy, the military power, and the industry, the technology, the demographics. These are all big ones. Let's start with one by one. Let's start the trade, because finally it's the money, the trade that makes the world go round. And take China and the rest of the world. While the COVID had not yet hit the world, China was absolutely going fully strong. Everyone said China has arrived. China will overtake the US. China will become even bigger than the US. Anything and everything, China could do no wrong. Then comes COVID. And then comes COVID, zero COVID policy from China on one hand, not much of help globally from the other hand. Then, of course, the world got after China because China started showing its true colors by denying certain things, especially information about the COVID. And thereafter, it turned into rare earth, it turned into technology, it turned into numerous things that came in, right? The icing on the cake, if you want to call it the icing on the cake, was the Trump tariff that hit China. And these tariffs today are approximately 47 to 47.5% on the at an average. This is not including the 50% special tariff which has been levied on certain sectors like aluminium, steel, certain household goods. That is in addition to the 47%. So China has been hit by the tariffs. The impact of these tariffs has been significant because Chinese exports to US shrank by 18%. Its GDP hit has been 0.5 to 1%. Factory activity is down. Yet, China has declared a trade surplus of over $1 trillion. How do you explain this?
Well, that's absolutely the right observation. Thing is, it's very difficult to take any product, turn it around, and not find it made in China. They still are the powerhouse. They make most of the products, and they've gone beyond being. At one time, China was called the factory of the world. But I think they've gone well beyond that and have truly established themselves as a technology powerhouse as well. And they have data. Like if you look at AI, what powers AI is really this the amount of data you have. And with the population that they have and the use of the data, they got all the data sets, may not be that demographically diverse, but still a significant depository. So I don't think we can count China out in any way. But what between COVID and beyond, what it has taught us is we can't rely on only one. The supply chain is really the vulnerable part for any global business, right? So I think what it has created is almost like a need to diversify your supply chain. And that's where even a small country like Scotland sees an opportunity, because if you take something like pharma services, while certain preclinical trials, etc., can be done by Chinese service providers, there is a risk. Whereas a smaller country with high technology like Scotland has a chance to play. So it's created opportunities for other players, apart from obvious things like onshoring. So nearshoring and onshoring has come back into the vocabulary instead of, at one time it was all about offshoring. In fact, when my first products in Seiko, I have designed it in California, but it was offshored to China to be manufactured. Now we would look at it very differently.
Yeah, so Pendy, one thing which always foxes me is, you had sanctions on China, trade barriers, you had various things, but China somehow very smartly managed to do the screwdriver technology and said this is not a Chinese product, it's a Vietnamese product, for example, or a Mexican product, or a Canadian product, European product. It has shifted its factories all over the world, especially in the third world countries, if you will, Mexico, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, all of these areas, right? Now, when that has happened, while Chinese businesses may have grown, may have started building a lot of things in China, from China being, semi-outsourced, if you will, for want of a better word, to other countries, and from there use the free trade rules, the trade relations between US or other countries with these countries, they managed to get that thing in. Hasn't that really speaking affected the economy of China itself? Because, you can't explain a $1 trillion trade surplus while your overall trade with US has gone down by 18%.
So I think you hit the nail on the head. It's how you measure things, right? So maybe the direct exports to US has come down, but the effective exports going through other countries, taking advantage of NAFTA with Mexico, is a good example of how Chinese-made products or Chinese products initiated in China and subsequently assembled in other countries do end up in the largest market in the world, and that's the US.
So is that the reason why Mexico has put 50% tariffs on multiple countries? India is one of them, but it has put 50% tariffs just because the US has lent on its shoulders and said, buddy, you better put these tariffs or I'm going to start blocking you.
Could very well be the case. Now, I just need to qualify. We are a apolitical organization, so my comments are purely based on observations, my observations, and on trade and economics. But end of the day, the reality is there will be political pressure from different governments and other governments, and when the U.S. administration realizes some of these products are coming in through alternative sources, for them to put the pressure is conceivable. I wouldn't know that for sure, but we could join those dots, I guess.
Right. How does this impact employment inside China? Because there are reports of employment in China having continuously rising. There were reports at one time, if you remember, just about a year and a half back, China had stopped reporting employment numbers, and that unemployment at that time had already hit almost 30%. Now there are people who claim over 50% unemployment if you're more than 35 years of age. And if you are less than 35 years of age, for the last 8 months running, the unemployment has been steadily rising, though it is not rising dramatically. It is rising nonetheless, and they say it is over 6% now. We have 1.2 million Chinese ready to come out of colleges and join these unemployed people because there are no jobs. How does this impact employment within China?
I think that is one of the vulnerable issues right now. They are vulnerable about it because if you take away most of the low-end manufacturing and move it to countries like Vietnam, etc. In fact, when I was in China, some of my product lines that were being manufactured by our partner was being moved from China to Vietnam. So that means that those kinds of jobs are disappearing from China. That's only accelerated. And now with the tariffs, etc., there's yet another reason for that to happen. So a lot of the Chinese labor comes from the hinterland to the coastal cities where things are manufactured, and they go back. And that's almost like a migration of labor. And when that doesn't happen, it does create a serious economic issues domestically.
Right. Trade is one major part. Tell me, how has China managed to diversify its trade, and how does this diversification of trade by China, and when you compare it with the diversification which India has achieved, how do you compare the two of them?
I think from my vantage point, what I see is India has a lot of capability, but they seem to have rested their laurels on services to a great extent. It's more recently, when it comes to apps, etc., there's been some very innovative products and solutions coming out of India. But still, when it comes to really deep tech, I don't see that coming out of India, whereas we do see that coming out of China, whether it's robotics or aerospace, etc. There's a lot more happening at scale from China than India.
Okay. Right. So, Pendy, the question is like this. India and China have both been slapped with tariffs as high as 50%. China is marginally less at 47%, but no big deal. At 50% tariffs, China, despite its exports to the US dropping by 18%, has still managed to grow its exports and has hit $1 trillion plus as far as trade surplus is concerned. How do you compare Chinese activities or Chinese methodology of dodging exports or effects of Trump tariffs and Indian efforts as far as Trump tariffs are concerned?
Right. No, that's a very good question. The way I would look at it is, if you look at China, is already their base is pretty high, right, of what they export to the US. It's many times what India does with the US. And with India, it's mostly in the services sector. So when you have a high base like that, and also when you have few alternatives to China, the market in the US still depends on many of the Chinese products. So even if the tariffs are there, it's being partly absorbed by the manufacturer, it's partly being absorbed by the middlemen and the importers, and partly by, if it's a retail product, by the distribution chain. And some of it is being borne by the US end customer. But until that changes, the demand picture isn't changing. The supply cost might have gone up, but at the end of the day, it's not getting reflected that much in of an inflationary impact to consumers. So that's how China is able to get away in a way. With India, the services sector by and large should be fine, but again the base is small, right? So, and then when it comes to some new innovative stuff, that's where I think China is frankly even leapfrogging the US in many ways, because they can think many years ahead compared to US, which is more short-term focus. So whether you take autonomous vehicles, you take the entire EV industry, you take the supply chain for the EVs, starting with the batteries and the the rare earth materials, where they have literally a stranglehold on the business. You can't, they're almost making themselves indispensable, or made themselves indispensable, I would say. So it'll take a long time to diversify that.
It's interesting you spoke about the rare earths. Look at the type of efforts that are going around globally as far as rare earths and diversification from rare earth is concerned. Even India has a rare earth mission wherein upwards of $1 billion have been committed to it. The US is doing it with single-minded focus, whether Donald Trump speaks to Pakistan, or he speaks to Indonesia, or he speaks to Australia, or he speaks to Japan. He's coming up with a packed silica, which is essentially devoted to rare earths. There has been significant work that is happening on this front. How long do you think this monopoly of China is likely to continue? Is it in months, is it in years, or is it in decades?
I don't think it's decades, and I don't think it's months. So it's somewhere over a year, I think, because it's not the source of the rare earth materials. I think there's multiple sources can be generated. It's the processing of the rare earth materials. I don't know the exact percentage, but I think upwards of 80% or maybe even 90% of the processing of rare earth materials happens in China. That's going to be the hard thing to replicate. And that's why it's not a matter of finding the next mine for rare earth materials and shipping it over to wherever it needs to be consumed. It's the processing, which is why I would put it in well over the months category too. Hopefully single digit years than longer. So it shouldn't take decades. I'm sure there are enough smart people to figure out what needs to be done.
Right. So let's move on to economy now, Pendy. See, typically economists define recession as 2 quarters or more wherein the GDP is falling, the employment is falling or unemployment is rising, internal consumption, consumer spending is reducing, and the industrial output is falling. On all these parameters, China seems to be scoring good points. See, it's GDP growth, they all spoke about 6%, 8%, upwards of 10% at one time, if you will. But right now, they're quite happy with a GDP growth of 4%, 4.2%. Right. But it has been falling month on month, quarter on quarter. The employment is falling. In fact, they say there is a curse of 35. If you are more than 35 years of age, it is very unlikely for you to get a job. And unemployment for people above 35 is upwards of 50%. Even for lesser than 35 years, the unemployment seems to be rising continuously for the last 6 months or 8 months or so, and is currently over 6%. They have a situation wherein consumer spending has been falling and falling steadily, to the extent that Xi Jinping came up with a stimulus package, a second stimulus package, and said, okay, you can take loans to buy new things. You must change your white goods every so often. Loans have been made even more easy for real estate. Despite that, consumer spending is not going anywhere. And, the industrial output, or the PMI, for the 8th month is falling. For property side, it has fallen to less than 30%. Anything less than 50%, a score of 50, is negative. For manufacturing, is just under 50%. It's only in the technology it seems to be going up. What is happening here in China? Is China in recession?
I wish I could give you some current information. So I can default to my prior experience there, and that is the Chinese are extremely hardworking, extremely keen on learning from whatever they can from whoever. They do not have any hang-ups of ego in terms of learning. I mean, they used to come to me to learn about how to do business in because their parent company was Italian, etc. And they admired Indians because a lot of the leaders of Chinese of US multinationals in China were of Indian origin. And they were curious how the Indians produce such good management talent, right? So they're always very hungry and learning, and I'm sure they'll try to find a way out of this. But to the current situation, which you have some excellent statistics on, I do, I cannot profess to know exactly what's happening there. But those are the statistics as we see it. But yeah, no, I mean, one would think they should be in deep trouble, but they don't seem to be.
Pendy, you've been seeing China for a long time. Tell
Mhm.
me, is China over-reporting its GDP numbers?
That's very possible, right? With China, it's very difficult to know what the real numbers are. That's part of the difficulty you have, whether you're living in China or outside of China. The numbers are something that you can never be sure of. So that's part
Yeah,
of the thing. Would it help them to show better numbers, higher numbers or lower numbers? It's all their strategy that they could be thinking over a multi-year period, multi-decade period, which most of us in the democratic world don't have that luxury.
yeah, because there are reports and some claim, very credible sources. Well, I really wouldn't be able to tell you whether they're credible or not. That indeed China has been over-reporting GDP numbers for at least a decade, and if that is true, then even that 17 or 19 trillion dollar economy of China is probably not even half of it. Have you heard any such rumors?
No, I've not heard those rumors. Again, what I saw with my own eyes was amazing development there, amazing interest in anything that's going on outside the country. Some really outstanding examples of high technology. But on the other hand, I once, my car driver lost his way, and we ended up in what looked like some of a small town in near Chennai, right? It was all being screened by a row of trees, so you couldn't see from the fast-moving traffic on a what is called what I call freeways in the U.S. You couldn't see beyond the trees. Everything looked nice, hunky-dory. But once you lost your way and got beyond the trees, it wasn't that pretty. But then again, that was 10 years back. So has that changed, or is that still in the same state? Is something that one would need to find out by going there.
Penny, there is this theory that China seems to be doing big ticket infrastructure development so that it can, in some ways increase the GDP numbers. Because finally, GDP numbers come by saying how much steel you've consumed, how much cement has got consumed, what has been the growth in terms of, various of those factors come into picture. Now, take China. It has built phenomenal kilometers and kilometers of high-speed rail where the occupancy they claim is less than 10%. There
Mhm.
are airports and airports and airports which are lying vacant. Take, for example, the BRI. BRI in many ways was to export Chinese surpluses so that they could use up their factory production capability, which is not being consumed within China or not being able to export. And they went into very questionable, very, uh, investments which can always be said, why did they ever go there? For example, Pakistan. For example, even many countries in Africa, South America. And many of these countries, these investments are not paying back. Take the example of the Hambantota port. The occupancy in the port is limited. Limited is a very conservative and a very optimistic term. Take Gwadar port and the airport at Gwadar. Gwadar airport has one flight every week. One flight. Gwadar port has had one ship in a year coming to call on. But billions of dollars have been spent. Now, where is China going to get this money back? Is the BRI investments all going down the drain? And if that be so, all the big ticket investments that China has been doing everywhere, including inside China, the latest one being the dam at over the Brahmaputra, which they have said will be able to generate so many gigawatts of power, and we will have water surplus, and we'll be able to take water to the water deficit areas of China. How do you read these kind of investments which China is doing? And do you really think China is the giant that it professes to be economically?
So what will need to be assessed is again over the long term, right? They do have the money and they're spending it, in their opinion, wisely. And if you take again going back to whether it's rare earth or any commodity for that matter, one could argue that investments in Africa or Latin America is to really get a stranglehold on the on the source of such materials, because all the commodities, whether it's a freely available today or not so freely available, there is a physical limit. Now, if they corner most of that, that's a strategic play. So they are investing in roads, etc. In some ways, one could argue it's what the British did to India, right? They built the railroads not for the benefit of the local people, but to move stuff out of India to the ports and export it. So I would say what China is doing is essentially laying the groundwork to take advantage of sources that they need to produce more value-added products and to send their products to whichever part of the world there is a market. So from that point of view, I think, and with them having the money, they're not starving anybody. Whoever I met in China seemed to be very happy. They didn't care whether that nobody seemed to feel as though they had human rights problems. They seemed to be very happy. They seemed to lead a comfortable lifestyle. They were all well dressed. One could argue are they hiding all the poor people somewhere, but generally speaking, people in very lower middle class roles seem to be pretty comfortable. So, so they could be investing wisely. Maybe there's no immediate returns, but they could be building a future. Which, while other countries, like including the US, are hurting with infrastructure, right? Many of our roadways and bridges are in questionable condition. These guys are got the latest and the greatest happening at their end.
Right. Let's take one last piece of what I wanted to discuss with you, and that, Pendy, is demography. China very recently was the most populous nation on the earth. India seems to have overtaken it a few months back. And today they say their population is about 1.4 billion people. Yet, there are questions that are coming up. And for almost the third year in running, Chinese population has gone down. The fertility, TFR, the total fertility rate is at 1. 2.2, 2.3 is the replacement level. Well, if Chinese fertility is at 1, it couldn't have happened in 3 years. It has to have taken probably a decade or maybe more than that to come to that level. Right? They have a birth rate crisis to the extent that there are numerous kindergarten schools and lower and primary schools that are shutting down because there are not enough students there. The one-child policy has played havoc as far as China is concerned, though they did try to bring in the two-child policy, but by then it was far too late. Now they want a third-child policy also. It doesn't seem to be working because the Chinese demography is on a nosedive. The average age of China is today upwards of 40 years. Contrast that with India, which is in the later part of 20s, 24, 25, 26, somewhere there. Right. How do you read the demographic decline of China and its impact in the long term? Also, do you think this demographic part of the decline of China will have an impact as far as its military buildup is concerned? Because finally, whichever way you look at it, whatever technology you may have, the war will still have to be won by the foot soldier who actually sits either in Taiwan or wherever else he has to be there.
So if you were to ask me what is the single biggest weakness that China is facing, it's the demographic issue. And this is not something where you can throw money at it and expect results. So whatever money they might have accumulated is not going to solve the problem. I think they did a lot of harm with the one child policy. And then, thanks to, if you were to put a golden thread to many of the questions you asked, if, if you look at the cost of living, etc., that has gone up steadily there, today the young couples don't want to have a child because they don't think they can give a great future for their child because it's so expensive. So by choice, many of them are not having children, let alone one child, right? So this is going to be, I think, the single biggest impediment for China's growth in whichever way you look at it, financially, or economically, militarily, or from a manufacturing point of view. And they're not an established service powerhouse, which fortunately India is, nor are they a service-based economy like the US. So they've not necessarily built up that piece of the infrastructure to say, okay, now the manufacturing crowd can move to the unemployed people can get into the service sector. They don't really have that well-established sector there or sectors there. So that I think is a real problem. The way they could solve it, but I'm not sure if they'll be open to it, is immigration. Will they open up their doors, and with the kind of control they need to have on their population, given the nature of their government, is that feasible? How open? Again, I think that is the single biggest question mark I would put on China.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely correct because China seems to have this 4-to-1 theory that every person supports two parents and four grandparents. So that kind of a situation is not the happiest situation for anyone to be in. Finally, Pendy, what do you think India can learn from the Chinese, especially with respect to trade, economy, and demography? These three things are what we spoke about.
Mhm.
What are lessons for India?
The lessons for India would be that curiosity and interest in learning from others without any ego seems was something that really surprised me. There's such a hunger to learn, and they're extremely hardworking. And I'll give you some simple non-business examples. I had a housekeeper, I had a chauffeur, and I used to give them different. Sometimes I used to ask them to come at 8 o'clock, sometimes at 9 a.m., sometimes 7 a.m. Whatever time I gave them, they came either on time or a few minutes ahead. And once one of them called apologizing profusely because they're going to be late because her cycle broke. And what she meant by broke was she had a flat. And she actually was turned out to be only 7 minutes late. And she was so apologetic. Now, I don't know, unless I'm a very lucky person who seemed to have had great staff, and these were not people that I could have, magically selected. That work ethic was extremely good. And even at work, I could see that. And I think that is one thing which always impressed me. They're really hardworking people, and and they didn't care what your color of your skin was, which country you were from, as long as they thought you had something to offer them, they were willing, they wanted to learn. So sometimes I feel, I mean, I'm proud of the fact that I'm of Indian origin. I'm proud of the fact of the number of people who've done well around the world from India, but I find that to be a minority. Many times I see a lot of people trying to take shortcuts, and the sense also in a way is missing. So as a result, when you have that kind of cleanup to do every time, all that affects productivity, right? Though, and in China, I found people were a lot more disciplined from that point of view in any walk of life, whether it's keeping to times or working hard or not taking shortcuts. There is some, I admire the Jugaad part of what happens in India, the improvisation, the creativity, and I don't think India should lose that at all. I think that's an area where India clearly has an edge over China. But I think what needs to be learned is that discipline and curiosity.
So essentially, you're saying work ethic, curiosity, don't kill the child in you.
Correct. Correct. Exactly.
What else do you think, as far as business is concerned, as far as trade is concerned, and even from demography, what do you think we could learn?
From the economy point of view, I think the thing the Chinese are very practical people. They are less. In some ways, I find in India there's a lot more ideology at times, and also a lot of I don't know if it's too strong a word to say false pride. And that is something which unfortunately affects us negatively. The Chinese will do whatever it takes to win the business. And I don't mean unethically, within ethical boundaries. And
Right.
that
So,
desire to win is very strong in China.
right. Thank you very much, Pendy. It's been a very interesting and a very illuminating conversation. Believe me, there is a feeling in India that China is going down the tube and it can collapse any day. Well, I have always firmly believed that China is too big to collapse. If it does, it'll happen over decades, definitely not in months, not in years. And definitely, China is a civilizational power. Civilizational powers do not disappear just like that. Right. There are a number of lessons as far as India is concerned with respect to China, where Chinese made mistakes and we should not. One of them is obviously in demography, where you can't bulldoze your way through using a one-child policy, for example, and then suddenly realizing, hey, we made a mistake, and you can't reverse that policy again. It's not a car that you can put into reverse gear and carry on. There are big things for India to learn, especially with respect to be curious, don't kill the child in you. Look at the fact that indeed there is something to be learned at every time, and there is ethics, civic sense. These are all aspects that we must definitely learn. There are issues as far as China is concerned, whether it is with economy, whether it is with trade, whether they are having a minor blip or a sustained minor blip over time, but a civilizational power will always come back. And that is where India has to keep its guard up. It cannot let down its guard and say, hey, China is going down, so I don't need to worry about China anymore. It will not happen. Comprehensive national power has multiple other things. We have not spoken about geopolitics. We have not spoken about the military. That, my dear friends, we will cover in some other talk with somebody else. Thank you very much, Pendy. It was a pleasure talking to you. Till then, Jai Hind,
Thanks.
Jai Bharat.
Appreciate the opportunity. Bye.
Bye.